Hey everyone, Modits here. The Beatles, they're a band, pretty good. I started listening to their music about a year ago and have stuck around it long enough to consider myself a fan. I've listened to all their albums, which leads me to today's video. In this video, I'll be ranking all 13 of the Beatles records. I probably have a lot of basic opinions commonly held by people, but I'm also likely to have some thoughts that are a bit more controversial, so let's get straight into this. I've only seen Get Back and Let It Be, but I do know that there have been quite a few Beatles movies with albums accompanying these films as sort of OSTs. The last spot belongs to the album that complements the film, Yellow Submarine. I don't need to do a ton of explaining why this album is last. There are 13 tracks on the album, 2 of them appeared on previous Beatle albums, and 7 of them are orchestral songs. While I'd imagine that these tracks work well in the context of the movie, this is still a Beatles album with only 4 original songs. I don't revisit these songs, with one massive exception in Hey Bulldog. That song is great, it has catchy electric guitars, and John and Paul barking like dogs is hilarious. I'm glad this album exists, solely because of just how much of a highlight this one song is, but this feels like the one case where the album was made for the movie and not the other way around. I've never seen this next album rank high, and I agree, I don't hate it or anything, but it doesn't reach the heights of other Beatles albums that came out shortly after and before. I will admit, I don't think I've really re-listened to this album, and the only song I come back to often is 8 Days a Week. And I should probably say this by now, I'm talking about Beatles for Sale. I could maybe have more to say about these songs if I re-listened to them again, but I doubt that it would raise the album much higher, if at all. I struggle with deciding between these next 2 albums. I love both, and they have some real highlights, but I had to give the 11th place spot to With the Beatles. With the Beatles doesn't have as many big hits in comparison to the next album I'll be talking about, but it's still a consistently enjoyable experience. There are great songs like All My Lovin' and covers such as Roll Over Beethoven and Money That's What I Want. One thing I'll note is that the album has a very chill vibe to it, and while I'd partially attribute it to the album cover, I think the fact that there aren't as many crazy big hits on this record adds to the more relaxed listening experience. I do believe the next album, or I guess technically the prior album, is better, but I had to spend some time thinking about it. That just gave it away. The next album is Please Please Me, the first Beatles record. I do think With the Beatles is a tiny bit more consistent, but this album's highs are so incredibly high. I Saw Her Standing There work so incredibly well as an opener for the band. Please Please Me, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You are all fun songs. And Twist and Shout, it's Twist and Shout, an incredible track where John pushes his voice to the absolute limit. This is a great starting point for the band, and it's not shocking that they became so huge so early. Next up is another album from the early Beatles era, and let me say this, I do prefer the later part of the Beatles music, but I do have quite a bit of fondness for these first few albums as well. Anyway, A Hard Day's Night feels like it took the lessons they learned from their previous 2 albums and used everything to create the perfect evolution of their music. The title track, A Hard Day's Night, is such a catchy and fun song that I always come back to it if I check out some tracks on this album. Can't Buy Me Love is another great single, and I heard a cover of If I Fell before listening to the Beatles, making it one of the 2 songs I'd heard before properly listening to the band, and I feel pretty certain in saying that the original version of the song is the definitive one. Really, the best word I can use to describe this album is, like I said, evolution. It evolves so much of what made the first 2 albums so good. Also, one final thing to note is that this album has no covers, which wouldn't be the case again until Rubber Soul. Now, they of course had a bunch of memorable covers, but it's nice to see these albums have music that is 100% them. I've been going for a while now, so let's move on. Help is what I consider the final album of the early Beatles era before they truly started to heavily experiment with their music. Luckily, it's another superb Beatles record that does a good job of capping this period off. Help is another perfect opener for the album, especially since the song is about acknowledging how hectic the Beatles' lives have been after becoming famous. You've got to hide your love away, you're going to lose that girl, Take It to Ride, and I've Just Seen a Face, which I especially want to highlight, are incredible. I've Just Seen a Face is a song that I adore, and there have been only so many songs that fill me with the same feeling this song gives. You can't talk about this album without talking about the second to last song, Yesterday, which enough has been said about it. It's such a simple and beautiful song that acts as a transition point between the early and experimental era of the band. Though, while the cover of Dizzy Miss Lizzy does feel odd considering just how final Yesterday feels, I don't think it affects the overall album that much. It's genuinely impressive how, except for Beatles for Sale, they're getting better and better the more music they made, especially since, at this point, they aren't even close to their best. I won't be surprised if this one is controversial. Revolver is in 7th place. I know this is an album held in high regard by a lot of people, and I am also a huge fan of it, but it sadly hasn't connected with me like the later albums on this list. I don't have anything negative to say about it though. Taxman is a fantastic opener with great guitars. Eleanor Rigby and Got to Get You Into My Life are incredible Paul songs that I come back to often. Yellow Submarine is a fun, whimsical kids song, and I absolutely love the track for it. And Tomorrow Never Knows is the perfect way to end this album. It's odd viewing this song in the context of everything else, since Strawberry Fields Forever was considered such a crowning achievement at the time. While I do love that song, as you'll see by future ranking, Tomorrow Never Knows is right there. Anyway, if this is my 7th place album and I'm already praising it this much, you can imagine how the following albums will be. In 6th place is the final Beatles album, the ultimate culmination of everything that came prior, Let It Be. Jokes aside, this is another classic album, but while I am ranking it highly, I will be stating some minor gripes. I feel a lot more connection to the album, since like I mentioned earlier, I watched both documentary films surrounding its creation. With Get Back especially, it's amazing seeing the tracks slowly but surely evolve into their finished versions. This album is supposed to go back to the Beatles' classic roots, and these songs couldn't have captured it any better. Kind of. Songs like Dig a Pony, I've Got a Feeling, and One After 909, that one specifically is actually a much older song being revisited, do a great job of making an album that feels straight out of an alternate timeline where they didn't go as experimental. Get Back is the prime example, and it's easily one of my favorite Beatles songs of all time. There are of course some songs which are a bit different. The Long and Winding Road, Let It Be, and Across the Universe are beautiful songs. While it obviously isn't supposed to be considered the proper ending of the band's discography, it's a lovely album with many worthwhile songs. Except there's one thing I need to mention. In 2003, a project started by Paul McCartney called Let It Be Naked was created. It is Let It Be with new mixes and alterations in the track list. And if we were including this, it would be my 4th favorite Beatles album. Dig It and Maggie May are super short tracks on the original Let It Be, and they were replaced with Don't Let Me Down. Two of Us is a solid song, but Get Back works as an infinitely stronger opener. While I like both versions of Across the Universe for different reasons, the naked version is super pretty. It manages to capture the feeling of the original recording. I barely remembered that For You Blue existed, but with the reintroduction of the acoustic guitar, it quickly became one of my favorite songs on the whole project. And having Let It Be as the final song just plainly makes sense. Now I won't say that you shouldn't listen to the original, because a lot of people won't agree with me and would rather go back to the older version, but in my personal opinion, this already awesome album is held back a tad bit by having a version that I prefer much more. We're finally getting to the top 5, starting with Rubber Soul. Being the start of the experimental era of the band, it still feels more like the early Beatles, but just like with the early Beatles, it keeps managing to be better than what came before. This is an album I could live in. Each track delivers a cozy feeling that I can't get anywhere else. Drive My Car is an energetic start to the album, and it, along with Norwegian Wood, perfectly sets the mood for what comes next. Michelle is a lovely track, especially with the use of French in the song. In My Life feels like John's answer to Yesterday, and it definitely matches that song in delivering a message about a common topic in a way that's just so beautiful. Some people may not be a fan of the final song, Run For Your Life, but I personally really enjoy it. It's just hilarious seeing such dark and threatening lyrics placed over such a upbeat guitar sound. While it doesn't have as many high points as some of the previous albums I've talked about, it has a consistently calming feeling that always makes this album great to come back to. 4th place, we've got the classic Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album used to be considered the Beatles' masterpiece album before Abbey Road took over, and it is definitely worthy of the praise. While it's debated for a while if there have been earlier examples, many people consider this the first concept album, as this album doesn't feature the Beatles, but rather the fictional titular band performing a concert. While there isn't a proper story like most concept albums, the point of the album is to get rid of the Beatles' personality for a while and write more out there songs. And it is an absolute understatement to say that they accomplished this. All of these tracks sound so drastically different from what they made before, and while this has probably been said a million times, it's crazy seeing how this was only 4 years after songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. I'll highlight a few of the songs here. I enjoy Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, both the opener and the reprise. I remember that while I did really like their previous albums such as Revolver and Rubber Soul, hearing that beginning guitar sound genuinely shocked me with how modern it was. From that moment, I immediately knew that I was going to be in for a ride. With a little help from my friends, it's a fun song. Ringo doesn't have the widest vocal range, and there's not going to be a song where he's tearing out his vocal cords or anything, but he's really just entertaining to listen to. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is a tribute track, but you can probably say that about nearly the whole album. Of course, you can't talk about this album without pointing out the closer, A Day in the Life. If any songs from their catalog should be considered a masterpiece, this is certainly one of them. All the elements of the song work so well together. The fact that A Day in the Life is actually a combination of two songs Paul and John wrote, the orchestra slowly increasing in intensity, the final piano chord that's played in its entirety, and the ending with a random snippet added at the end. This should 100% be considered a musical milestone of an album, but once again, there are still more albums to talk about. This one may surprise people with how high it is. Magical Mystery Tour is my third favorite Beatles album. Some people may not even consider this an album since it was released as an EP in the UK and was later released in America as an LP, adding some singles that never made it to an album. Many consider an album, and it is also an incredible one. It has the least amount of tracks of any Beatles album, and I do think it helps the album as there are no dull moments on it. For me, this is a further evolution of Sgt. Pepper and is the final step in the experimental era of the Beatles. The title track sets the mood for an adventurous and whimsical album. Blue Jay Way is a rather eerie and trippy song. I Am the Walrus is so genius, and how it prides itself on its absurdity. Hello Goodbye is a simplistic song that flies with its concept. Strawberry Fields Forever is Strawberry Fields Forever. It's a genre-defining track. Penny Lane is another fun song. All You Need Is Love is incredible, especially with the She Loves You callback at the end. Even if I didn't specifically highlight certain songs, there's not anything here I dislike. This album should easily be considered among their best work, and it's a shame that it's usually a bit lower down in people's lists. The next one I'm not going to be going over for too long, because everybody's already talked about what needs to be said about Abbey Road. It was the final album recorded by the Beatles, and it's largely praised as one of the greatest albums of all time. I'm going to say something shocking. I think it's deserved. Every song here represents a unique part of the band, and every song matters when it comes to this album. Iconic tracks like Come Together, Something, Oh Darling, Octopus's Garden, I Want You, and Here Comes the Sun are what many people immediately think of when they think of this band. Maxwell's Silver Hammer is a silly fun song that slots perfectly into the album. Then, there's the Abbey Road medley, where every track flows into each other beautifully until it reaches the explosive finale of the end. And then, we can't end it now, they have the first ever hidden track in music history, a little song called Her Majesty. The vocals, the bass, the drumming, everything about this album works. Yet, somehow, there's another album in first place. As much as I love the previous albums I've discussed, I can't say I prefer any of them over my favorite album, not just of the Beatles, but of all time. The Beatles' White Album is interesting, to say the least. The White Album attempts to go back to basics after how innovative and wild Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour were, and this was a point where the band was a complete mess, and you can clearly see where the cracks that will lead to them breaking up. But ironically enough, being such a mess is what leads to this album being so great. There are 30 songs on this thing, and it's basically the Beatles throwing whatever they felt like at the wall, not caring if it even sticks. This leads to a special musical experience where every track feels so different from the last. There's so many tracks that I come back to constantly. Back in the USSR, Obla Di Obla Da, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Blackbird, Your Blues, Helter Skelter, Revolution 1. Even though songs are considered not so great, I come back to because they have such an odd, entertaining charm to them. There are many strange tracks like Wild Honey Pie, The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, Why Don't We Do It in the Road, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, and of course the infamous Revolution 9. Even if listening to Revolution 9 feels like the longest 8 minutes of my entire life, I still appreciate the song being here. I value every song on this album. I wouldn't want a single part of the album taken away from it. It's creative, every member of the band gets their moments here, and I've never seen an album like this. If I was forced to pick one album I listen to for the rest of my life, it would be the White Album. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, check out some of my other content. If you really did, subscribe. If you've already listened to all the Beatles albums, leave your rankings in the comments. That's it for now, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.